broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, What are User Journeys? My name is Chris Jorgensen. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Unleash Technologies. For those of you who do not know us already, Unleash Technologies has been dedicated to creating award-winning websites and digital experiences for our clients since 2007. We have a particular focus on open source web technologies, with our primary platforms being Drupal and WordPress. User journeys is a topic that has recently been top of mind for many of our clients. So we decided to put together today's webinar as an introduction to the subject. At this time, I'll be turning things over to Chad Hester, Senior Solutions Architect here at Unleash Technologies. Chad is a software engineer and Senior Solutions Architect with more than 15 years of experience. He has worked exclusively with open source software since 2005, and he has experience working with everything from small to medium to corporate enterprise solutions. With that, Chad, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. So welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to talk today about user journeys and, more specifically, user journey mapping. And, of course, why you should care. So we put together this little presentation that we'll go through. And I wanted to give a special thank you to NAGAS, the National Guard Association of the United States, for allowing us to use some of their discovery materials in this presentation, so we get to see some real-world things. So first and foremost, before we get into user journeys and give you a little context, we have to also acknowledge that this is a part of user experience research. And user experience research is not perfect, and it doesn't have to be. As individuals, we want to constantly try to improve ourselves. And the main value that we're trying to get out of user experience research is to create empathy and develop an understanding by understanding different perspectives that may not be ours. So through that research, we can take a look at a lot of different exercises and different data points, but we have to keep top of mind what the value of that is. What are we trying to achieve? Not just go through the paces. And if you're new to user experience research, then understand that it is a very large field. Nobody can possibly know it all. You have psychologists, you have engineers, you have visual designers, and so many different types of professions come into play. So if you're new to user experience, we suggest getting familiarized with what works best for you and where your strengths are. Try to learn from different social groups, find a mentor, and latch yourself into not just the study material, but practicing these things in whatever it is that you do. So with any sort of learning effort, since we're on the subject, we put together this little graph to really indicate the responsibility of the learning process. There are really different points in time that you can graduate from one level to the next, and there are different key areas as you learn. So maybe you just encountered something for the first time. Maybe this is the first time you've ever even heard about user journeys. That's just, a term to you. Or maybe you're acquainted. Maybe you just casually read about something. Or you've studied these sort of things for a while, but maybe you haven't done anything with it beyond studying things. But we start to enter the inexperienced to the experienced channel, if you will, the more you study and the more you actually put into practice these things. Eventually, if this is something that is your career or something that benefits you from just a personal level, you can get to a level where you are considered a master. So it's important to acknowledge the responsibility that you have when you're doing something new like this. So let's get to the subject. What is a user journey? Really, it's about how people move through some sort of a conversion funnel or a process. Maybe I want to buy a car. Maybe I want to register for an event. Maybe I just want to go make a purchase at a grocery store. All of those are journeys. And you interface with different things throughout that process, and we're going to touch on how we can explore what that actually means. We want to be very sensitive to not just the steps in a process, but how a person can feel and what they're thinking, because this greatly influences how they may or may not make decisions through that process. They can abandon the process. Maybe they're just frustrated. We want to understand why. And there are different types of people that can have different experiences. So, for example, I may have an elderly gentleman that wants to purchase a car. He goes to a used car lot and he test drives a car and he goes into the center to fill out paperwork. And not a single point during that journey of his did he ever touch a computer. But you may be technical minded and you may represent a different audience segment and you may have a completely different experience. You may never actually see face to face a person. You may not ever test drive something. Maybe you do everything online. And that's still a legitimate journey. And you're still going through the same uh, type of exercises, but just different steps. You may have different feelings. You may have different thoughts. And your experience is just in general different. So, what's the purpose of user journey mapping? So, this is really about an analytical process where we take user feedback, user information, data from things like analytics tools, and we try to understand not just the audience segment themselves, the development of user personas, but also try to understand how a person goes through different phases of a process. This gives us the perspective on their emotions and creates empathy for us so that way we can understand what we can affect in either a process or a system that we're responsible for maintaining or influencing in some shape or form. We want to be sensitive to all touch points in a process. Maybe there's a newspaper. Maybe there's a brochure that you're handing. Maybe it's just a conversation. Maybe it's a website. Maybe it's a mobile application. All of these are legitimate touch points and devices in a process. We want to be sensitive to any pain points and understand that pain is not actually a bad thing when it comes to pushing somebody through a process. Sometimes pain is the thing that actually influences a person to act. So let's just keep that in mind. Sometimes a user journey map can help us identify a conversion funnel. Maybe we don't know what they are, and we want to try to tease out the process a little bit as we're analyzing something. Or if we do know the funnel, we just want to clarify what that actually is. Maybe somebody's registering for a conference, but we really don't know the steps that any type of audience segment goes through. So we use a user journey map to actually pin that down a little bit. And this can inform other user experience research or the overall strategy of whatever it is that you're responsible for maintaining or building. We'll typically take these user journey maps and use them over a very long period of time. And we can collect these artifacts, if you will, and we can validate them or expand upon them. Validating an artifact in user experience research is typically, like any other scientific process, one that is backed up by research in the data, user feedback, and testing. So that way we're validating our assumptions. Oftentimes we want to compare the same conversion funnel between different personas to understand the difference in experience, like our car purchasing example. So really, it's also about orientation, understanding the person that's going through this, or the person type rather, and what steps they're going through in this process. There could be different steps for different types of people, or even the same person may go through a different process at different points. What are they feeling? Where are they trying to get to? Are they getting stuck along the way? And is there something that we can do to improve things by getting visibility on this? So we're getting out of our assumptions. We're trying to say, okay, well, I feel like people are probably getting stuck in this process, but let's put it on paper. Let's communicate together with stakeholders and users and try to visualize this a little bit. And that's the point of this. So how does this relate to user personas? Well, user personas are another user experience tool that helps us represent a critical audience segment. Maybe you have a website that has members, or maybe you have a application that has conference attendees, or perhaps you have a school site that has parents that come to it. Those are all different audience segments. And what we can do is we can do research on these types of people and then give a representation of them. And we'll demonstrate a little bit of that in a moment. But with this, it allows us to study real users using their feedback, using surveys, and try to embody them in a persona. Or if we don't have that type of feedback from users, which is unfortunate, and we should always try to validate our assumptions, so we need to uh, uh, identify when a persona is based on assumptions versus actual data. So if you're developing any user experience artifact, just make it a point to let anybody that's making decisions, that's building a strategy, to know whether or not this is a validated artifact. And if it's not, that's okay to an extent, but we also want to push towards trying to validate those things before making critical decisions in design. But we can at least use these personas to method act as a character. So it's just like drama class. We screw our heads into whoever this person is, and we go through whatever experience that they're having, click through a website, go on site, talk to people, and we behave as if we're them. So that way we can try to create empathy. This allows us to compare different user experiences to each audience segment. So a user persona is really about embodying a lot of attributes that matter to whatever it is that you're studying. Now, if somebody's interested in green technology, that's fantastic if that's a part of a large segment, but maybe that matters if I'm buying a car, but maybe it doesn't matter so much if I'm attending a conference. So we want to contextualize user personas and make them a bit more applicable to the thing that we're studying and not just get really outlandish with things. So how do we create a user persona? Well, first and foremost, user research and interviews. We want to talk to people if possible. We want to also reference things like demographic information. So in all likeliness, if you have a website, you, I hope, have access to something like Google Analytics, and you can take a look at that demographic information. But it is not the only aspect to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to user survey results, user feedback logs. This can include things like phone calls into a call center. This can include emails. This can include in-person feedback at a conference or something like that. We want to review behavior patterns with different tools. So this could include heat map studies, eye tracking software. Different studies that help get real data to create personas that more accurately embody the behaviors and the mentality and the perspective of your audience. We want to also pay attention to things like job roles, salaries, or trends in an audience segment. And this is really important because, well, if a person has a very high salary, they're more likely to be loose with their purse strings. And if they do not have a large salary, traditionally, they may not be so ambitious to spend. And this can influence our perspective on pushing somebody through a conversion funnel to see what sort of thing we can do to continue to incentivize people through. Typically, we want to give our user persona some sort of fictional name. And this can be alliteration like Michael Member. This can be something that we all refer to as a group. So when we're talking about Michael Member, it helps us identify with them. It helps us really paint that picture like they're a real person in our head. And this really helps us with our research. We want to give them an age and an occupation. We want to understand their goals and motivations, and maybe even write a brief bio. What's their background? Where did they grow up? What brought them to the place where they're likely to make certain decisions? And we want to be plausible. We want to stay within that bell curve, not on so much the fringe cases when we paint these things. And that, again, takes research. And we want these people, these personas, to relate to the applicable tasks, as we said before. So if somebody frequently goes to the gym and has a very busy work schedule, that may influence how they behave when going through a conversion funnel. If it's too many steps, then they may grow impatient and abandon the funnel. So we want to be sensitive to things like that. So we have some example user personas that we put together for NAGAS, again, National Guard Association of the United States. These were 3 different audience segments: a corporate member, an individual member, somebody that's Congress related, and a potential member. And you'll notice, given the fact that they're an association, we're trying to study mostly things like membership. and other things on the website that maybe only members can do or that maybe only members typically have access to. So you'll notice here we have ages for everybody, and this is typically based on demographics. We actually give everybody kind of just a stock photo, and this helps us again with just understanding between the name, the photo, and painting kind of this general picture of who they are. It lets us have them stick in our mind, and it allows us as a group to really communicate about these fictitious people, these characters, if you will, as we go through other user research. So a common question that we get is a user journey like a user story? Well, not exactly. They're really two different types of artifacts, but they're both very important. So, and one can certainly influence the other. Uh, User stories are typically small tasks, and the smaller the better. It typically takes time to break these things up, but they're not hard to make really at all. And user stories are oftentimes used in agile development. They help build up an agile product backlog. So that way you can work through, well, what sort of thing do we need to account for in functionality? Is this usable? Is this something that we can actually achieve? And how are we building this? We can also take a lot of different user stories and put them together in what are called epics. And this may be I add as a guest, I add a product to the cart because I'd like to purchase it. And then you may have, I go to the cart and then I hit checkout and then I fill in my payment information. And then I receive an invoice because I need something for my records. Those are three user stories and they make up an epic of the checkout process. So just to understand what they are, how they're used, what value they bring, they give us a perspective to understand things like acceptance criteria and lets us understand what we're building things for. So user stories help orient us. They help us understand what a certain type of person may need to do. Maybe as a high school student, I want to apply for a student loan. Maybe as a parent, I also want to do that. And the difference in experience between the two is also one of perspective. So in some of these examples that we have, a high school student versus a parent, what motivates me to make a decision is going to differ slightly, and we need to understand that. So you can see that at the very end. So I can attend college versus so my child can attend college. Who's paying for this too? The user story is broken up typically into three general sections in a statement. So who is this for? What task are they doing, and why are they doing it? And there are a few different formats for presenting these, but this is the general concept. So you can see this is different than a user journey. When we take a look at those artifacts, we'll try to understand that. But before we get there, another common question is, well, how does this relate to a user flow? So a user flow and a journey map, they both contain steps in a sequence, and that's about where they start to go away from each other. A user flow is much more appropriate to help diagram a process to articulate what that is and show different decisions or different areas where you're going to this page versus that page, or what sort of permissions you may need to move from one place to the next. And we can exemplify that in a second. It helps us not only visualize these things, but also improve things like system efficiency. Is it 5 steps? What if we move this thing over here and make this different decision over there? Can we shorten the steps? That's really where user flows come in handy, is because they're a tool for not only visualizing these things, but optimizing these things. But user journey maps can benefit from existing user flows, and they can also inform how to change those user flows. So then the question becomes, well, which do I create first? Oftentimes we want to create a user flow first, but that's not always necessary, typically, but not always necessary. So a user flow is just understanding where you're starting, what choices you're making, and then what happens next in a sequence. And they can start branching like a choose your own adventure book if you're. So here's an example of a user flow. This is actually a page flow, if you will. It takes these little iconic versions of a page so that way you can understand what we're looking at. And in this case, we're actually showing Nagus. They have memberships that they sell. And you can see here that we can go through either an action menu in the top of a page or a main menu. There's a main menu section for members. And then there's a page for joining and renewing. And that's the main landing page for becoming a member. From there, I can either choose to go take a look at the member benefits. I can reel back in. I can renew if I'm an existing member. Maybe I need to log in. And that's a different process as we've identified. We have different annotations throughout this experience, and sometimes we branch out to external pages, and that's fine to acknowledge that. So we do that in this what's called a page flow. And we have a few others in this presentation. Here's the renewal process. So note that we have a branch for existing, and note we have a branch for new members. This is just acknowledging different processes. But at no point in these user flows or page flows are we acknowledging how people feel, what they're thinking, anything outside of the website. This is very specific to just the website. And this is an appropriate artifact if that's something that you need to study and adjust, or even just articulate. Here's an event registration. And these are going to become a bit important because we have user journeys that relate to these as well. And here's writing to Congress. And this one I really want to call out because when somebody acts, it's like we said earlier, it's not always about positive emotions. Oh, I'm excited to buy a car. Sometimes these can stem from negative emotions. I am frustrated. I need to write to Congress. And this is an important thing to observe in things like user journey maps. So all of these different artifacts are different, and they can work together. Typically, user personas are something that we start with in user research to help understand key audience segments. You don't need a persona for every single audience segment or subsegment. Like maybe instead of just focusing on high school students, so I want to focus on high school students from a certain state. Maybe I'm in Baltimore. I'm taking a look at in Maryland students versus out of Maryland students. That's a subsegment. So these are tools that we want to continue to come back to over the course of time, similar to any sort of marketing strategy. This stuff is not a mistake and it's not a trial and error. This is about us doing the work and researching things, validating our assumptions, and coming back and making informed decisions. User stories help us tell very short stories about what a person is trying to do and why they're doing it. Very short sentences. And this can accumulate in large sets of these, and they can branch out and be related and sorted. If you're not aware of what user stories are, definitely do your research. It's a very good tool. User flows help us diagram things. And then lastly, user journey maps help us empathize and gain perspective on the process that a person goes through. So how do I create a user journey map? So I want to give this first point a little bit of context. Templates are helpful when you're repeating something a couple times in a row. So that's where they're helpful. But this doesn't make it a sort of a checklist or a catch-all. Be prepared to come up with multiple templates. But if I'm working on a project with a team, I want there to be some consistency if I'm comparing multiple journeys. So that's really what we mean by using a common template. And it can be a template that's different per project. That's totally fine. And it can be a template that's different per what you're trying to achieve. So get out there, take a look at what sort of user journey maps people are creating to understand what you may want to create and what sort of value you're bringing to things. We want to include a reference to the user persona in the user journey map, just so we can acknowledge who it is and what they might be feeling, what motivates them. We want to document the basic sequence of tasks, so how are they going through the process? And those tasks are actually divided into 3 discrete stages. We'll visualize this in a moment. Awareness or discovery, this is just, okay, I heard about a conference, or I heard about a membership opportunity. Consideration or interest is where we're digging a little bit deeper. Hey, this might be something that I want to look at or something that I want to act on. I'm not sure yet. And then evaluation and conversion. This is where we're moving into that phase of actually acting and doing and completing. So registering for a conference, paying for a membership, those sort of things. And then each touch point, this is really where those diagrams and those user stories just don't really acknowledge the importance of what device a person's on or what medium. Again, newspapers, TVs, conversations, emails. It's not just about websites. This is all a part of a user journey. And the thoughts that a person would have at each one of these points to understand what's going through their mind, what would compel them to move to the next step, or why are they caught on this step, and a graph of their emotions through the process so we can really understand and empathize. So let's look at some of these. We want to present these findings to stakeholders so that way we can communicate and discuss these things and understand what it is that we may want to do next. So this is really where that value starts jumping out. We want to refine conversion funnels. We want people to get through the funnel faster, more successfully, and we want to also present this to users to see if we're on base or if they have any concerns, because this is the validation of things. This can also inform our product backlog. We keep coming back to this, but the agile method, don't want to belabor it necessarily in this presentation, but if you are working in an agile workflow, this can greatly inform what makes sense in the priority of things that you can do to make improvements. We can create user stories to identify critical tasks and anything that was missing. So the user journey can influence, hey, is there just something about what this user is doing that we just didn't think of? Or a user flow to help improve things. So we can go back and forth between these tools to just, again, grow, improve. And then we want to test these things. If we make a change, what impact does that have? We don't just want to assume that what we did was positive just because we think it was or the data showed that it should be. We want to come back and test it and repeat. And then, of course, anything that we do on the website, anything that we touch there, we want to optimize. So it's really about how people feel through a process and getting them through that. So a few good examples. You can find some online, of course. We have a generic example that we can easily use and share. And then the examples that we got from the National Guard Association of the United States for their discovery effort. So just a rough example. I have Michael Member. He's going through the journey of registering for an event. So we can see Michael Member. He's 72 from Bethesda, Maryland. He's a CEO at Example Company. Makes $200,000 a year. He's primarily interested in sailing. What does that have to do for the conference? But he is motivated by going to conferences and networking with his peers and staying current with industry trends. He's politically sensitive, and he's also preparing for retirement. Yeah, he's a 72-year-old CEO. I would imagine so. That's pretty long. And he's mostly focused in promoting the key services of his business. That's important if you're networking with people at a conference. We have a backstory for him. Just going through the process, and then we'll go through each one of these phases really quickly. You can see how we've layered things. So from left to right, this is a timeline. From top to bottom, these are just different perspectives on the same thing. So just the process is he reads a conference brochure. This is the awareness phase. He's become aware. He talks to a coworker, and that coworker reminded him about an upcoming conference. The touch point is a discussion about that conference and the brochure. Maybe we created the brochure, so we have potential influence over that. And we can see his emotion goes up for the excitement. He then shifts over to the consideration phase. And this may be the point where he actually starts to hit the website. Now, he hits more of a neutral feeling when he's planning and reviewing. And he works with his secretary to review things like travel options. So he's working with people. That's another touch point. He wanted to discuss with coworkers whether or not they wanted to attend. maybe review some sponsorship opportunities, because as some of us may know, going to a conference, sometimes being a sponsor gets you attendance as well as other sort of discounts and perks. And then he reviews the registration and sponsorship options, and he's starting to feel pretty good about that until he hits some difficulties finding that information. It's negative emotion, moving into a positive emotion. He's registering for the event. He booked his travel in the conference, and his secretary helped him and his 2 employees get that booked. And then he attends the event. So you'll notice that we have a star to indicate that he converted, but sometimes it's good to have a little cliffhanger to acknowledge what happens just shortly thereafter. So that's sometimes one thing that we do in these journeys. We can see some of the journeys that we put together for Nagus. And in this, you can see a potential member considering membership. He converses with other fellow officers, so he's a captain in the Air Guard, as well as a teacher. It's important to understand the National Guard uh, uh, members are typically in more than one occupation. You can pay attention to not just all the touch points, the steps, the thoughts that we have indicated here. I'm not going to go through every single user journey that we have. Uh, and you can see the roller coaster of emotions that a person has. Now, we have a few other user journeys, and we can see different touch points that a person has. So in this case, it's an existing member. They get an email. They kind of hold off on even looking at something, so they put something in their calendar. And then they finally start considering it, discussing it with people, and then converting eventually. Again, another roller coaster of emotions that they go through. And we can pay attention as we look at these user journeys at what sort of things that we may be able to influence and which things we can't. I can't necessarily influence what conversation he has directly, but maybe there's something that I put in the email which can then lead into that. Like, what are they discussing? Well, maybe I can influence that a little bit. I can't tell him whether or not he's going to put something in the calendar, so that's not necessarily relevant to something that we're going to change, but it's important to acknowledge that that might be a behavior, that there may be a delay. So that way we can understand how people are moving through the conversion funnel and where they're getting stuck for legitimate reasons. Another version of an event registration, a bit more detailed, and also indicating that a person can get to a point of awareness from multiple entry points. So in this case, this individual member read some legislative news and noticed a link about the annual conference, but then he just went about his day. So he's aware. Then he got an email notification about membership renewal, and there was also a link about the conference on the website when he went to renew. So again, there's different ways that people can encounter something and then move into the consideration phase. Again, there's a bit of a roller coaster of emotions, different touch points, talking to people is pretty common, different thoughts, converting, and then also acknowledging that even after a person converts, part of the motivation and the excitement behind their conversion is getting to this other side, booking a flight, and then looking at things like local restaurants and other travel with different officers in this case. Here's one user journey that I definitely want to hang on a little bit because we're seeing different touch points here. Here's a non-member who works for the media. She came to the Nagus website to read some legislative news. And we can notice that she's having some different emotions based on, for example, what she just read about in that legislative news. This is important to acknowledge. That negative emotion may propel her forward to act. She's also reading newspapers, seeing news reels on TV. So these are touch points that we can't influence unless we own those media networks. But then she comes back, intrigued by the Right by Congress option that she saw when she was originally reading that legislative issue. She goes to take a look at the progress of a bill, because again, Nagus does write about bills that are going through Congress. this is still the consideration phase. She has still not acted yet. She's still seeing news about this bill and legislation, talking to different people, and then due to her frustration after talking to some of her peers, she comes back and then she converts because she writes to Congress. So it's important to acknowledge that not every conversion funnel is an action based on a positive emotion. Here we have a newsletter sign up. Now, sometimes we can very quickly tease out an improvement. And in this case, one of the improvements that we teased out was maybe to move somebody through the consideration phase, it would be helpful to show them an example of a newsletter. So that wasn't necessarily a part of the original Nagus website, but it's something that we thought might help push somebody through. So it's these little opportunities that without these diagrams, maybe we would or maybe we wouldn't tease out. So that's what user journeys are in the context and relationship to a lot of other user experience work. So I like to talk about continuous improvements, and that's your continuous improvements. I need to continuously improve just like you do. So I wanted to share some general thoughts based on the experience that I've had and the experience of other peers is yes, you should absolutely learn more. Find a mentor. If you don't have somebody that does user experience work, find somebody. That's one of the best tools because it's the beacon in the dark. Sure, you can self-learn and that's perfectly fine, but speaking from personal experience, it takes 10 times longer. Just having a guide really is helpful. Attend social events. If you have user experience meetups or things related to that, go. Participate, do these exercises. Don't just read about them. And then go back and study with that newfound knowledge and experience of your own. And that may change your perspective on things. Practice things quite a bit. Review them again. Discuss them, present them. So a lot of times there's a theory of the best student is also a teacher. So teaching may also be helpful, or at least presenting your findings in front of other people. And it's okay to be wrong. There may be some things that I'm wrong about right now. And I want to hear from people. I want to grow. I want to learn. Tools are helpful, but they can be a crutch. So, but it is important to be open to different tools and techniques as new things come out. So maybe there's a new design tool. Maybe there's a new research or analytics platform. Just pay attention to those things, be aware of them, and try to practice using them. And then new techniques. Not all of these techniques existed for the longest time. There are different things that come up, and we can communicate about those, and then just repeat. So we have a few resources here. I'll share the slide deck with the webinar afterwards. So just in case you don't catch all these, I know it's a wall of text. You can go over these, and these are a few different things for user personas. User stories. You'll notice that there are some common websites that keep coming up. Usertesting.com, Smashing Magazine, usability.gov, uxdesign.cc, the Nielsen Norman Group, absolutely. Some agile websites for user stories, since that's a very user story centric thing. User flows. Sometimes not only do you want to understand the technique of building these sort of diagrams, but also perhaps find libraries, the stencils that you can use to represent things. So that way you don't have to create them from scratch. And user journey maps. These are just a handful of things that we found very helpful to describe user journey maps. A user journey is what they do. A map is helping to diagram it. So that's what you would look for if that's something that you're doing. And I would imagine if you're here listening to this webinar, that this is something that's of peak interest. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on about user journey maps. And I wanted to hear any questions that you may have at this point or any sort of feedback. And if you don't want to respond now, or if you have questions that come up later on, then here's the email address that you can email, start@unleashed-technologies.com. We're happy to discuss this sort of stuff with you. So I wanted to address the first question. I realize that you can't talk back, but I'm going to just read some of these questions out loud and try to do my best to answer them. And then we do have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, but if we end early, we end early. So the first question is, how do you know what the emotions are at any of these touch points? What data is that based on? Well, there are two different ways. One is more favored than the other. When we create user personas, we create a character, and we can empathize with that character. We can understand what motivates them, what sets them off, what they're sensitive to by just creating that. And that should, for all intents and purposes, be based on not just assumptions. If that's the only thing that you have, then you owe it to everybody involved to follow up on those and validate those assumptions. And if you're wrong, make corrections to your user personas, because that influences a lot of other user research. Step two is, once you have these accurate user personas, and even if you don't going into the user journeys, you should follow up and put more accurate user personas through those user journeys. But even if you don't, you can method act as that person. Again, put yourself in their shoes, try to understand what motivates them, go through the process yourself. So if I'm registering for an event, thinking, okay, I'm a member of this organization and I just got this email, so I look at the email, I click on this link. Maybe I just hate email. It's yet another spam thing. And that's frustrating. I think most people can experience. Then I go through forms. I identify points where forms are quick, and I'm happy about that. Or maybe they're laborious, and I get stuck in an area, and I'm upset about that. And those are different emotions that I experience, along with thoughts like, why this form? But in an ideal situation, we shouldn't be method acting. Method acting is good to build assumptions, and it still helps push us in a good direction, but it's not a very scientific direction. So in an ideal situation, we want to talk to actual users. We want to put a user in front of a computer and actually have them go through the process of signing up for something. Observing them passively, maybe using eye tracking software, and then giving them a survey, hopefully without biases, to fill in after their experience, or just doing an interview before and after. So I think that it's very important to get accurate feedback from a large group of people. So user research oftentimes will emphasize the importance of doing things like focus groups and user interviews and surveys and looking at feedback logs like customer feedback. Like, do we get a lot of emails that people can't complete this form, or this is one field that never accepts input properly? And we want to gather all that stuff before we make these assumptions and then try to use that because that's valid information. So that's where the emotions and the data comes from. So the next question that we have says, hi, thanks for the useful presentation. So you're welcome. I have a lot of mentors, so I want to pass on my thanks to them as well. Can I say a few words about the touch points and how to identify them? So that's a really good question. I think sometimes it's really obvious what the touch points are, and sometimes it's not. I know that super vague response, but it's again not a one size fits all. So it really depends on the funnel. So let's do a couple examples. We took a look at. I'll pull one up because we all like visuals, right? So I think this is a good one. The touch points are partly based on an assumption of how people may become aware. And what we'll typically do in research is we'll directly ask stakeholders at an organization, so what sort of marketing efforts do you have to bring people to your website? Can we study the Google Analytics that says where people are coming from when they land on these specific pages? So that's one form. So there's no one thing, but that's just one data source that lets us know where people are coming from. In addition to that, Sometimes it's a bit of intuition. So maybe, I'm sitting down with my spouse and watching television and I'm upset, and I'm also secondarily aware of this one website that has a right to Congress form. It's a bit of a leap, but if I happen to know that, then one may push me to the other. Uh, Other touch points that are valid is conversations with people, whether it's your peers or you're at some sort of an event. So just being aware of that. But really, talk to people, talk to stakeholders, go through the processes yourself. So if you can go through these conversion funnels and have a few other people go through these conversion funnels, sometimes you'll tease out those touch points, whether it's an email, a brochure. Um, just understand, like, at what point would you break away from the website? Do you need to go talk to your spouse or your family about expenses before spending money? Do you need to go, in the example of buying a car, do you need to go do a test drive? That's a touch point. Do you need to go to the bank? That's a touch point. Just acknowledge each one of these steps. And if you feel like you're jumping too far, just break it down even more. Totally fine. But it's not, as we said at the very beginning, it's not about being perfect. It's not about being right. It's just about painting something that articulates an idea of moving from one starting point to one end point and understanding a possible journey along the way. There are tons of journeys that you can experience, but we're trying to understand the trends based on the feedback and the data we have. So we can continue to make multiple user journey maps based on different user personas or just different processes that a person can experience. The more of these that we create, the more areas where we can find adjustment or pain points or areas that we can influence. So don't think of it as like a singular exercise you do once and then it will make everything better. You need to keep coming back to these things. And the more you come back to it, the easier it is to do these things. Okie doke. I don't see any other questions. I'll give it a minute and see if anybody has any others. I'll pull back up that last slide so you can see the email address. Okay. Well, I think that might be all we've got. I appreciate all the thanks from people. Again, I'm Chad Hester. I'm a solutions architect here at Unleashed Technologies, and I really hope that you enjoyed this webinar. I look forward to hearing from any of you if you have any questions or feedback beyond this webinar. And go forth and make some user journeys. Take care, everybody.